They called it the war to end all wars. They were wrong. It was not an end, but a beginning. The beginning of a new relationship between humanity and violence. The birth of a mathematics where the primary variable was human flesh. This was no longer war as practiced by Napoleon or Caesar. This was not the clash of empires or the ambition of kings. This was something colder, something industrial. A fundamental recalibration of the equation between life and territory. By the winter of 1915, the poetry was dead. The flowers in the rifle barrels had rotted. The songs had faded into the constant, low drone of artillery. What remained was a simple, brutal formula. How many men must be expended to gain how many yards of mud? The Western Front had become a laboratory, a vast, open-air experiment in industrialized slaughter. The subjects were millions of men. The hypothesis was that willpower and mass could overcome machine guns and high explosives. It was a hypothesis that would fail catastrophically and repeatedly for 3 years. To understand Verdun and the Somme, you must first understand the logic of the machine. The battlefield had transformed. It was no longer a field at all, it was a factory. Its raw material was men. Its product was attrition. Its managers, the generals in their chateau far behind the lines, were engineers of human sacrifice. They spoke a new language. They did not speak of attacking the enemy. They spoke of wearing down his reserves. They did not seek victory in the classical sense. They sought the collapse of enemy morale through systematic destruction. They plotted graphs of shell consumption versus enemy casualties. They calculated how many tons of high explosive were required to soften a mile of enemy trench. The soldier ceased to be a warrior. He became a component, replaceable, like a spent artillery shell casing. This was the grim, dehumanizing revelation of 1916. In the age of mass production, life itself had become a consumable. The French High Command codified this logic into a doctrine, the grinding mill. The German High Command conceived of it as a bleeding white strategy. The British called it, with chilling bureaucratic detachment, the Big Push. The names differed. The mathematics were identical. The laboratory had a focal point, a ring of forts around an ancient, serene city on the Meuse River in France, Verdun. To the Germans, under Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn, Verdun was not a strategic objective, it was a psychic trap, a symbol of French national pride so potent that France would be compelled to defend it to the last man. Falkenhayn's memo was a masterpiece of cynical calculation. The objective is not to take Verdun, but to force the French to defend it, and in so defending to bleed their army to death. It was war reduced to a sadistic equation, attack a place of such emotional value that the enemy must pour his entire human reserve into the meat grinder to hold it. On February 21, 1916, after a thunderous bombardment of over 1 million shells in a single day, the German Fifth Army advanced. They did not expect to win. They expected to trigger a process. They succeeded. The French commander, General Philippe Pétain, issued his famous order, "They shall not pass, ils ne passeront pas." It was a rallying cry that became a death sentence. A river of French divisions, the Noria system, was fed into the Verdun sector. They would hold a position for days, suffer catastrophic losses, then be pulled out, shattered, to be replaced by another fresh division destined for the same fate. The battlefield itself became a geological atrocity. The forested hills around Verdun, places with names like Le Mort Homme, Dead Man's Hill, Côte 304, Fort Douaumont, were methodically stripped of every tree, every blade of grass, every contour of the original earth. The landscape was reduced to a primordial soup of churned earth, shell craters filled with oily water and human fragments. Men drowned in mud. They suffocated in the collapsed tunnels of underground forts. They were vaporized by direct hits from howitzers so large they had to be brought to the front by railway. The air was never clear. It was a permanent, choking miasma of cordite, chlorine gas, and the sweet, cloying stench of putrefaction. The sound was not intermittent. It was a constant, physical pressure on the eardrums, a universe of noise in which the human voice was a pathetic, lost whisper. Verdun was not a battle. It was an environment, a hell so complete it created its own weather, its own geography, its own physics. While the French were being bled white at Verdun, the British were preparing their own entry into the laboratory. the Somme. If Verdun was a German experiment in psychological attrition, the Somme was a British experiment in material supremacy. The logic was different, but the underlying mathematics were the same. The British commander, General Douglas Haig, and his staff believed in the creeping barrage and the material battle. The formula was straightforward. A sufficiently massive and prolonged artillery bombardment would annihilate the German defenders, cut their barbed wire, and destroy their machine gun nests. Then, the infantry would simply walk across no man's land and occupy the empty trenches. For 7 days and nights, British guns fired over 1.7 million shells at the German lines on the Somme. It was the loudest man-made sound in history up to that point. The ground shook for miles. In London, people reported feeling the vibration. The generals listening in their headquarters were convinced nothing could survive. They were wrong. The bombardment was impressive, but fatally flawed. Many of the shells were shrapnel, useless against deep dugouts. A third were duds. The German defenders, sheltered in bunkers dug 30 feet deep into the chalky soil, simply waited. They survived. And when the shelling lifted at 7:30 a.m. on July 1, 1916, they emerged, manned their machine guns, and saw a sight that defied belief. Across a 25-mile front, line after line of British infantry, many of them the volunteer PALS battalions from the same towns and factories, were walking slowly toward them. They were laden with 70 pounds of equipment. They had been ordered to advance in orderly lines at a walking pace to maintain cohesion. They were not attacking. They were being processed. The German machine gunners, sickened and awestruck by the sheer scale of the slaughter, later described it as Die Maschine lief wie am Schnürchen. The machine ran like clockwork. They did not need to aim. They simply swept their guns back and forth along the fixed lines of men. By the end of that single day, the British Army had suffered 57,470 casualties, of which 19,240 were dead. It remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British military. The PALS battalions were annihilated in minutes. Whole streets in English industrial towns would later receive the telegrams on the same day, creating waves of grief that hollowed out communities. The Somme offensive did not stop. It continued with grim, dogged persistence for 141 days. It became a war of small, brutal actions: the capture of a crater, a ruined farmhouse, a few hundred yards of trench. The gain was measured in yards. The cost was measured in divisions. Inside the laboratory, the human body was being systematically redefined. It was no longer a coherent whole. It became a collection of vulnerabilities to be catalogued by the new machinery of death, the machine gun, the weapon that dictated the geometry of the war. It created beaten zones of interlocking fire, making frontal assault a form of institutional suicide. High explosive shells, the great randomizer. They killed not through aim, but through statistical probability. A man could be eviscerated, buried alive, or driven insane by concussion without ever seeing the enemy. This gave rise to shell shock, a term that tried and failed to medicalize the experience of having the universe explode in your face on a daily basis. Gas, the ultimate betrayal of the warrior's code. It was a weapon that ignored courage, skill, and strength. Chlorine seared the lungs. Phosgene caused a delayed, drowning death hours after exposure. Mustard gas, introduced later, was a vile, persistent agent that blistered the skin, blinded the eyes, and rotted the lungs from the inside. It turned the very air, the substance of life, into a medium of death. The gas mask, turning soldiers into insect-like, goggle-eyed monsters, became the ultimate symbol of this dehumanized warfare. The flamethrower, a weapon that summoned a primal terror, clearing bunkers with a jet of liquid fire. The response to this stalemate was not tactical genius, but heavier machinery. The tank, first used by the British in small numbers on the Somme in September 1916, was a lumbering, primitive, mechanical beast. It broke down, it got stuck, it was vulnerable. But its significance was apocalyptic. It was the first weapon designed not to kill men, but to make the entire defensive architecture of the Western Front, the trench, the wire, the machine gun nest, obsolete. It was the future, clad in riveted steel, announcing that the age of flesh versus steel was ending. But the most profound transformation was not in the weapons, but in the minds that endured them. The soldiers of 1916 were not the volunteers of 1914. They were not romantics. They were professionals of survival. They developed a dark, existential humor. They created a detailed, sardonic lexicon for their world. Jack Johnson for a heavy shell after a famous boxer, whiz-bang for a fast-moving shell, coffin nails for cigarettes. They lived in a state of radical psychological dissonance. In the front line, they existed in a primordial state of terror, filth and brutality. A few miles back, at rest camps, they could have a bath, receive mail from home and drink tea. They were constantly shifting between the modern world and the Stone Age, a psychic whiplash that could shatter a mind. The term shell shock was a diagnostic failure. It implied a physical cause concussion. But what was breaking was not the nervous system, but the story of the self. The stories that had sent them to war of glory, patriotism, clean combat shattered against the reality of the mud and the machine gun. The mind, unable to reconcile the narrative with the experience, simply broke. Men froze. They wept uncontrollably. They lost their sight, their hearing, their speech, with no physical wound. They were suffering from a moral and existential injury. The military command, steeped in 19th century notions of courage and cowardice, often saw it as malingering. Some were shot at dawn for desertion or cowardice, their trauma their only crime. Others were subjected to brutal electric shock treatments to force them back to the front. Medicine was struggling to diagnose a sickness of the soul. By the end of 1916, the laboratory had produced its results. At Verdun, the French had held. The Germans had not passed, but the cost was beyond comprehension. Over 700,000 casualties on both sides. The French army was crippled, teetering on the edge of mutiny. On the Somme, the Allies had advanced about 6 miles, the cost over 1.2 million casualties. The British Army was now a hollowed-out force of conscripts and survivors. No decisive victory had been achieved. No war-ending breakthrough had occurred. The front lines in December 1916 looked remarkably similar to those in December 1915. Just a little more scarred, a little more poisoned. But something fundamental had shifted. The War of 1914, the war of movement and illusion, was a distant memory. The War of 1916 was a war of accounting. A grim, endless transaction where life was the currency, and the exchange rate was catastrophically poor. The men in the trenches now knew the truth. They were not heroes in an epic. They were fuel. Their blood was a lubricant for the stalled machinery of grand strategy. Their suffering was a line item in a staff officer's ledger. The romance was not just dead. It had been revealed as a lie, a beautiful, poisonous lie that had sent them into the grinding gears of the machine. The experiment of Verdun and the Somme proved one thing conclusively. In the new equation of industrial war, defense was king. The machine gun, the barbed wire, the artillery spotter and his balloon, they held all the cards. The attacker needed a superiority not of 3 to -1, but of 10 to -1 or more to have even a chance. And that superiority was paid for in corpses. The world had discovered a terrible new law of physics in the 20th century. It was infinitely easier to destroy a human life than to gain a meter of ground. The generals asked, "How can we break the stalemate?" The battlefield had answered, in a voice of thunder and screaming metal, "You cannot. You can only break the men." And so they did. Verdun and the Somme turned human life into a mathematical variable in a grand, brutal equation. What are the equations we live by today? What cold, systemic calculations, economic, political, algorithmic, treat human dignity, privacy, or autonomy as expendable variables in pursuit of efficiency, growth, or security? Where is our machine flesh?